I'd also like to sort of begin with a bit of a caveat or an apology that this is very much work in progress. It's a bit of an experiment, if you like, really. There are many elements of this argument that I'm still sort of thinking through, so I really welcome sort of questions, attacks. Okay, so in this paper, my aim is to try and think about the categories of performance and performativity as a way to think theoretically about the broader category of contemporary art that is as post-conceptual art, within the context of Southeast Asia and its related discourses. The talk moves through 4 kind of related sections. First, I'll talk about the terms and the categories in question. Second, I'll talk at some length about some examples of artworks which I think we might think about productively in terms of performativity, but without performance. Third, I'll turn to briefly talk about an example of performance that's being discussed with actually very little reference to performativity, which is a phenomenon that I think might be familiar to many of us, so which we can perhaps talk about more in the discussion. And then fourth, I'll kind of finish with another caveat and a bit of a gesture beyond language. So I want to think through the discursive circumstance in which performances are very often spoken about and even canonized with very little reference to their performative qualities. It's a funny thing to do at the end of this symposium, because actually this is something that, a problem that has been, I think, really effectively and elegantly and inspiringly avoided over the last 2 days. But nevertheless, I think it's a problem that exists and that is worth grappling with and perhaps learning from. So performances is being spoken about and canonized with very little reference to their performative qualities. This is a starting point for me. But by the same token, I think that we often do speak of performativity in artworks when there is no performance involved in any conventional sense of the word. So the term performativity has moved very far from its original meaning as conceived by J.L. Austin in the 1950s in relation to language use. Instead, it seems to me that the term performative, when used in relation to contemporary art, might now be thought of as having perhaps taken on a character more akin to the term painterly. So I want to twin performativity and painterly. Painterly, of course, is no longer medium-specific, but rather is used to describe painting-like qualities, whatever they are, in artworks made in a range of media, including, most notably, films and moving image works, as well as photography. So this easing apart, if you like, of the terms performance and performativity is significant for me as a point of entry to thinking about the centrality of the cerebral, the conceptual, rather than the corporeal in much discourse on contemporary art. So I'd like to begin by quoting from a short story by a Thai fiction writer named Pabda Yun, which was originally published in Thai in 2000. And my purpose in quoting this is to introduce the kind of foundational assumption of my talk, which is the idea that contemporary art can be thought of as being, by definition, post-conceptual art. So Pabda Yun writes, "If Picasso were an art student today, he'd probably flunk the course. The professors would say he was stuck in the past, that his stuff was old-fashioned. Why waste time drawing strange, hideous creatures? Nowadays, it isn't enough to sit there sketching nudes. You have to think deep. You have to have a concept. So my friends at art school were all into concepts. All they did each day was wander beyond the school walls to scavenge for concepts." So I enjoy this passage as I think it encapsulates many of the key tenets of the idea of contemporary art as post-conceptual art, an idea which might be familiar to many of you from the brilliant but often rather inscrutable and always deeply Eurocentric work of the philosopher Peter Osborne, who's devoted many brilliant essays and a couple of books to understanding this idea of the notion of contemporary art as post-conceptual art. Yet Pabda Yun manages to get to the heart of it pretty concisely and with humour, while also pointing to the importance of practices that are research-driven, socially engaged, or in other ways, post-studio. So as an aside, I should say that I think there's a lot more to unpack in this excerpt from Pabda, which I'll have to leave to another time. One especially noteworthy detail for me is the fact that the paradigmatic emblem of a modern art that is stuck in the past or old-fashioned or a waste of time is Picasso, rather than, say, Hua Haivatak or even Simbirasi or any other local, national or regional modern artist. This phenomenon for me brings to mind the art historian Kevin Chua's provocation that, and I quote, not having a relationship to modernism of both East and West is, ironically, contemporary Southeast Asian art's belatedness. The tendency which Chua diagnoses in this article of contemporary art in Southeast Asia being overwhelmingly discussed in relation to questions of society and politics, which is something that Nora addressed very well yesterday in her keynote lecture, can, I suggest, actually be further generalised as a tendency to privilege discussion of the conceptual over the aesthetic, the material, the temporal, and the performative when we're thinking about and talking about contemporary art. So let's return to the passage from Prabda Un. The act which Prabda describes of wandering beyond the school walls to scavenge for concepts, or in other words, being a post-studio contemporary artist, might be considered as being in some ways inherently performative, in the sense that wandering, that scavenging, is bodily and temporally bound. Yet the performative quality of wandering and scavenging, that trace of the bodily and the temporal, is clearly of secondary importance to the concepts which are the essential ingredient, if you like, that makes contemporary art what it is. As many of us will know, in Western-centric discourse, it's sometimes said that contemporary art inhabits a so-called post-medium condition, in the words of Rosalind Krauss, because it's rejecting the medium specificity which was the hallmark of Western modernist discourse, especially in North America. So I don't believe that this idea offers us much in relation to Southeast Asia, chiefly because I don't believe that medium specificity was ever an idea with the same importance in Southeast Asia. And in fact, I would argue that modern art emerged and developed in the region through transmedia intersections between various different kinds of art. Yet, of course, it's nevertheless clear that in Southeast Asia, as elsewhere, contemporary artists nowadays do tend to work in a variety of media. And I'd suggest then that perhaps Southeast Asian contemporary art, which is always in scare quotes it's as a construct, that Southeast Asian contemporary art is defiantly unconcerned with medium and specificity, not because it's rejecting this kind of aspect of Western modernist discourse, medium specificity, but rather because it's post-conceptual by nature. The fact that, as Prabda pithily puts it here, nowadays you have to think deep, you have to have a concept. So how to make sense of the role of any single medium then within this context? Why fix our attention on performance, as we're doing here, and in many other settings nowadays? What does it mean to think of performance or performativity as a medium? What is performance? What is performativity? At this symposium, as in many other exhibitions in recent years and many other contexts, we've seen countless examples of the slippage of performance and performativity into and their dependence on photography, video, and other media. I have no desire to sort of try and offer any kind of fixed definitions of these slippery terms, but rather what I'm trying to do is to ask a series of questions about the sort of the range of meanings that are attached to performance and performativity as categories or as media within the context of contemporary art in Southeast Asia. So some questions which I'm trying to think through are, does performance hold a special position within Southeast Asian contemporary art? What is its status as a medium? Is performance privileged as a medium within the post-conceptual practices that I believe define contemporary art? Or does the tendency for contemporary artists to work with diverse media and techniques, building on the transmedial nature of much modern art in the region, yet extending this through the turn to the conceptual, does this mean that performance is just another one among many strategies that are adopted by artists? The reason why I find these questions fertile and useful is that thinking about the nature and position of performance within Southeast Asian contemporary art, we're also necessarily thinking about the nature of contemporary art itself as a category of thought and discourse in the region. So I'll move now to the second chapter of the talk, in which I sort of want to look at some examples of artworks that I think can be considered in terms of performativity, but which do not involve performances in any conventional sense of the term. I'll do this through discussing an exhibition I recently curated at the NTU Centre for Contemporary Art Singapore's lab, titled And in the Chapel and in the Temples. But I'll first briefly mention a few other examples as well to point to the kind of breadth of this field, and some of these might be familiar. So for me, I think perhaps the clearest instance of artworks which feature performativity without performance are those which play with the idea of liveness within a digital era. And I think that Chung Dai's statement at the beginning of her talk that performance needs the body, I think is a really interesting idea to bear in mind here. So in one iteration of Erika Tan's multi-part project titled Halimah, the Empire Exhibition Weaver Who Died Whilst Demonstrating Her Craft, a video features a computerized vocoder-style voiceover which purports to be Halimah herself speaking as if she were performing from beyond the grave, perhaps as an undead spirit in May's terms. And in a similar play on liveness and digitality, of course, the Critical Dictionary of Southeast Asia that Chung Dai has just spoken to and demonstrated to us broadcasts constantly new, or in other words, constantly live, new moving imagery that's generated live not by humans, but rather by an algorithm. Mimicking the aesthetics of digital manipulation, but in fact filmed live under the sea, is Tara Heng Sapakun's You Lead Me Down to the Ocean, which premiered at the APT last year and is now on show in Bangkok at Nova Contemporary. A large video installation as part of the project shows tropical fish swimming past military tanks, which were sunk under the sea in the Gulf of Thailand by the Thai military. The fish look almost like computer-generated images, but they are in fact real. They're already vibrant tropical colours amped up by the colour grading process, which the artist contracted out to the same company which does post-production for popular Thai TV dramas. I worked closely with Tada while he developed this work, and I recall at one stage in the process, as he looked at some early draft footage and some underwater photographs, he wondered aloud whether perhaps he should ask the divers who he was hiring to perhaps dance underwater in front of the camera. And he fairly quickly decided against this, realising that the movement of the fish against the spectacular inertia of these tanks was performative enough without the need for any actual performance. To turn to another example, I don't recall the collaborating duo, artists Amy Lien and Enzo Camacho, ever having expressed a desire for their own work to be performative. Their works have occasionally included performing bodies, either their own or those of other persons, as you can see in these two examples here. But in interviews and in conversations, Lien and Camacho always insist on their work being, in their own, I think, quite carefully chosen words, not so medium specific. I remember at a studio visit with them several years ago asking them whether they felt that performance held any special place in their practice, or whether using performance was in any way different from working with any other medium, and the answer was an emphatic and unhesitating no. Lien and Camacho's work for the exhibition I curated at the NTU CCA Singapore was performative, I believe, in several ways. Comprising a wall drawing or mural, and an hour-long lecture, the piece was a work-in-progress presentation of the duo's research on another mural, which you see on your right there, painted in 1950 by the celebrated Filipino-American modernist painter Alfonso Osorio, who was a friend and collector of Jackson Pollock's work and a member of a prominent dynasty of sugar plantation owners in the Visayas in the Philippines. Lien and Camacho's mural took the basic composition of Osorio's 1950 mural as its starting point, overlaying its semi-psychedelic, gestural yet hard-edged, menacing yet transcendent imagery with scrawled words relating to the multiple social, political, economic and art historical discourses through which the artists were approaching Osorio's painting. Completed in a mad rush over the course of just a few days and nights prior to the exhibition's opening, the mural was performative in the sense that it was a great physical labour to get it finished. Yet after some lengthy discussion about this, the artist decided firmly against making any part of that process of its making open to any kind of public or visitors, thereby foreclosing the possibility of it being read as a performance even in part. Moreover, the artist declined for snapshots like these, which I took showing them at work on the painting process, to be circulated publicly. But more than this, though, I feel that the mural was performative in other more complex and important and perhaps interesting ways. The words that comprised the large part of the image were painted using a hand-mixed material which the artist described in the accompanying wall text label as comprising, and I quote, real/imitation blood, molasses, semen, soil and sweat. This description was a somewhat tongue-in-cheek joke about the reputed presence of blood and semen in some of Osorio's works, including a celebrated series of drawings made with an experimental wax-resist technique, which he reportedly completed at night time in the Visayas after having worked long days painting the mural in the church. Leanne and Camacho were interested in thinking about the different kinds of masculinity that such aesthetics and materialities might embody in Osorio's work, including because of his identity as a queer or gay man, but one closely associated with the paradigmatically hetero-macho Jackson Pollock. This was one of several intersecting lines of inquiries which the artist pursued in the hour-long lecture which accompanied the mural, the text of that lecture, which was presented on the LED scroller screen, which you can see there, takes the place of the heart in the figure of the Christ. Leanne and Camacho's mostly synthetic, inky, paint-like substance had an uneven consistency, resulting in the presence of gluggy textured accretions and blobs which remained in the surface of the completed mural. In an aesthetic, material, and almost tactile way, this imbued the mural with a kind of performativity which meshed seamlessly with the conceptual gestures toward the performativity of the act of painting, either a mural at a grand scale or a secret, sexy, queer drawing. And this aspect of the work did not go unnoticed. In an essay published in the Contemporary Journal, the Singapore-based writer and curator Wong Bing Hao, who specialises in queer and trans theory and practices, employed deliciously visceral language to describe and explicate Leanne and Camacho's work. Wong wrote that upon encountering the iconicity of Osorio's sprawling, imposing mural, Leanne and Camacho read it as a multivalent cipher, one that can be reprogrammed and dilated in its meanings. Their project flexes language, spoken, written, drawn, represented, to convey forgotten or effaced aspects of Osorio's life and artistic practice. So obviously I'm emphasising here some of the words which Wong used to kind of emphasise the materiality, the corporeality, if you like, of this work. Wong continued that in the mural, information flows through the figurative veins of Leanne and Camacho's resurrected angry Christ, congested in some parts, crossed through in others. And Wong's concluding judgment describes the transness of Leanne and Camacho's mural, which extends excitedly into numerous other terrains and tributaries. In all of these various ways, Leanne and Camacho's mural was performative in the manner in which it was made and in the traces of that making which remain in the work itself, integral to its meaning. Yet in the photographs that I exhibited alongside this mural, taken from the Buddhist Archive of Photography in Luang Prabang, Laos, the performativity was to be found not in the way the images were made, but rather in the way that they were used and presented, and had been used and presented by monks in Luang Prabang over the course of the past 120 years. The digital projections I presented were a selection of around 300 images that I'd chosen from a total of over 35,000 photographs held in the Buddhist Archives collection. All photographs that were either taken or collected by Buddhist monks. Before being collected into the Buddhist Archive, which was also co-founded by a monk and is now operated by a former monk, the photographs were used primarily as teaching aids for monks wanting to explain subjects to novices as diverse as history, geography, Buddhist philosophy, Cold War politics, and so on. The photographs were, in other words, performed in a manner not unlike that which Nora has suggested Kong Wang Hao performs his Singapore Art Archive project. Having talked about instances of performativity without performance, I now want to very quickly sort of point to the idea that performance is often discussed in terms that relate chiefly or almost exclusively to the conceptual bases of the work without any sense of performativity or bodily qualities. I'll go through this quickly as I think the phenomenon will be fairly familiar to many of us. The single example I want to offer of this displacement of the performative in place of the conceptual is the project called The Artist Village 20 Years On, which was a major exhibition calling itself a retrospective, held at the Singapore Art Museum in 2008 with an accompanying catalogue published the year after. The Artist Village, of course, requires no introduction, thanks not only to several speakers who preceded me over the last couple of days, but also thanks to various complex and I think quite problematic canonizing processes, which I think can be discussed further in another setting, and which Eileen Legaspi Ramirez mentions briefly in her essay published in the latest copy of Southeast of Now. This 2009 publication of The Artist Village 20 Years On, although slender, comprises 10 substantial newly commissioned texts, in addition to archival materials such as newspaper clippings, reviews, photographs of performances, and so on. Looking at the list of titles in the catalogue is instructive. Not a single one of them includes the words performance or performative, nor any related terms like bodily or live or act. Nor do these words appear, not even one, in any of the dozens of subheadings which are typographically highlighted throughout the catalogue's design. Indeed, these texts are chiefly about the concepts and social concerns which the Artists' Village artworks and projects engaged with, rather than their corporeal nature. In an essay written by the late artist Li Wen, who we've just heard a whole lot about, the use of performance is mentioned only after a discussion of the Artists' Village's use of other unconventional materials for making drawings. Li Wen writes that, and I quote, "Not only the ideas of using ready-made as art material liberated us into the infinite possibilities of creativity, it also spurred us into seeing and using our bodies as object material, as well as subject narratives for art making itself." What strikes me in this passage is the dissolution of performance and the performative into the use of unconventional materials more broadly, and also the repeated emphasis on the conceptual rather than corporeal processes, the ideas of using ready-mades and bodies as subject narratives for art making. Okay, so I now finish with a brief fourth chapter. If you could please play the video. We don't need the sound though. So I just leave this playing in the background as I talk. I want to end not with a conclusion, but rather with a further complication. I've tried to point to a shifting apart of performance and performativity, but nevertheless I want to insist that the corporeal and the conceptual, of course, are not dichotomous, should not be thought of in dichotomous terms. Even if concepts are sometimes privileged by an artist or a curator or a critic, in experiencing an artwork, we may be gripped instead within our bodies in ways that often defy language. What I'm showing here is the opening few seconds from a 2005 video made by Chiang Mai-based artist Araya Rajamren-Suk. It depicts the artist wearing a false belly to fake her own pregnancy on the campus of the university where she teaches. After wearing this fake pregnancy belly for 9 days, she revealed the truth, and many people were hurt or upset or confused. The artist has spoken about this in several interviews, both in Thai and in English, and she's also the responses of other people to her faked pregnancy is also the sole focus, I would say, of this video as well. Yet Araya has not described what it felt like, physically or emotionally, to wear the pregnancy suit. She's only spoken of the reactions of others. So let me say again, the corporeal and the conceptual are not dichotomous, and indeed they're inseparable. If the contemporary art of Southeast Asia features performativity without performance, and if we can sometimes hear people thinking and talking about performance without much reference to performativity, and if contemporary art is post-conceptual art, as Pab Dayun sort of suggests to us, then these are things that we can apprehend not only intellectually, but also with our bodies, as Araya shows us. And as Araya shows us, these are things that we can apprehend not only alone, but also with others. Thank you.